trig, I can say enough to make it seem like I remember some things. So, all right, yesterday, so we were taking a look at. I'm going to keep the lights back here a little bit. Plus my legs are getting sore. No, so if you want to take TWAs home and take a look at them, or you want to ask questions, you can keep them. Otherwise, the bin is back there, so the folder you just drop off on your way out the door. Yesterday, I think we did a pretty good job going over the overall structure of the essay. Remember the two main options that were thrown out there. We had agreement that, may as well recap the whole thing. You're certainly going to state whether you find his behavior to be reasonable or not, and then identify an overall significance early on. And then you would have two body paragraphs where you'd be taking a look at behavior that you don't find or do find to be reasonable, but people would find to be at least a little bit different or eccentric, and then you explain why it's reasonable or not. So we had the fact that he overreacts to everything and then becoming hypocritical. Where things got a little bit more wide open for you is where do you want to put overall significance? Some of you are going to go in a third body paragraph and have that whole body paragraph be about the significance of the work. Others, we're going to kind of have this with each body paragraph, so you probably only have two body paragraphs, but within the body paragraph, mention the behavior, 2 or 3 examples, why it's reasonable or not, but whether you find it reasonable or not, why it is overall significant to the work as a whole. One of those is not better than the other, so it's really more of comfort for you. If there would be a concern that I have, it would be if you go into third body paragraph with overall significance, you need to make sure that you still connect the behavior, the specific behaviors you went over, and why it does tie into that overall significance. If there's any place where a disconnect could happen, I could see it being in that third body paragraph. Where here is, all right, he overreacts, but it's okay because, and explain it. And he's hypocritical, and here's some examples, but it's okay because. And then in a separate body paragraph, Salinger's overall purpose is to, and whatever purpose you come up with, you need to make sure those behaviors tie in with it. So if you're writing about him overreacting and being hypocritical, those behaviors should tie into whatever that overall significance is. So if you're afraid of some kind of disconnect occurring, it might work better for you to mention the overall significance in those body paragraphs where it creates maybe a little bit more natural transition to occur. Not going with those ones up there, but if someone mentions, his use of alcohol and the fact that he smokes too much or those behaviors you want to look at, that's perfectly fine. But if the alcohol and smoking don't tie into the overall significance, you really didn't help yourself with choosing those behaviors. So when it comes to the thought process as to how am I going to set this up, even though it might not be the first thing you write about, the first thing on my to-do list, I would probably want to decide what is my overall significance to the meaning of the work as a whole. Because if you don't have that part figured out, it's probably going to start to fall apart. After I've figured out my overall significance, then I would identify the general behaviors. Then I would narrow that down a little bit more and specify, specific examples of those behaviors. And the last thing I'd probably do is actually ultimately decide whether or not I find his behavior to be reasonable or not. Then I could kind of decide, do I want to defend, do I want to refute, or do I want to qualify? But I think if you identify this first, then you have a better chance of picking the behaviors. It's very easy to find faults with Holden, but all those faults might not necessarily tie in with that overall significance that you are looking at.
So you're saying if you agree or disagree that it's reasonable as compared to his Holden's actual situation, or just in general?
Let me clear. This gets messy looking at it again. The word reasonable is in quotations purposely because it gives you a little bit of leeway. I think the words that sometimes people have question about are going to be reasonable or delusion or eccentric behavior. I don't have a set definition. This is a long way to answer your question, so you can go, you're not answering it. I don't have a set definition for reasonable in my head. That's something that's going to be open to interpretation. That might be something that you decide you want to establish early on and explain what you view to be reasonable or not. Mentioned this yesterday and realized you weren't here. I think if you were to look at a lot of his behaviors in a vacuum, folks would go, I don't agree with what he's doing. It doesn't make sense. You could say it's immature. You could say that it's stupid. Whatever. By looking at his situation, context of it, things that have happened in his head, that's where the needle might sway for some people going, you know what, I don't agree with what he's doing, but I understand, and therefore I find it reasonable. If you were to defend his behavior, it doesn't mean you're endorsing it. So you don't have to come in here with a bottle of scotch and start smoking a cigarette and writing your TWA. You're not going to be in here very long. Although I guess it'll be up to the sub to find out if you did that or not. But you could certainly go, I don't agree with his behavior, but this is why it's reasonable. And that would justify, defending it. If you find his behavior to be reasonable, then you probably are going to look at it as being eccentric, where it's outside the norm. It's not typical. People could go, Mr. Kane matches his pens to his shirt. That's a little weird and eccentric, but okay. If you find his behavior to not be reasonable under any circumstances, then you're probably going more in that he's delusional, he's detached from reality. Why would anyone have that number of pens to go with those number of shirts? That's pure madness, is going to be more of that delusional aspect. Regardless of whether you find his behavior to be reasonable or not, for that significance, you're kind of going, okay, I don't agree with the behavior, or it's perfectly fine. Regardless, though, this is why Salinger is including it within the work. And remember, what's the one argument you cannot use? Makes the book more interesting. That's terrible. It'd only be worse if you went, this shows that Salinger is trying to make the book more interesting, and then I'll throw up on the TWA or put it in the litter box or something like that. So Lexi, going back to your original thing, you don't have to go, yes, this is the way to live your life by defending it. But certainly the circumstances that have surrounded him, that's going to play a big part in whether you find it reasonable, justifiable, understandable, whatever word you want to put in there. But if you don't have a significance, you're not going to get very far. Certainly you want to make sure you identify that within the introduction, along with whether or not you defend, refute, qualify. Whether that goes in the third body paragraph and the other two does not matter, but it needs to be there, and there needs to be a direct relationship between those behaviors and that significance. So, if you think the way that he is using alcohol and cigarettes as a coping mechanism to deal with deeper troubles, and Salinger is trying to expose the harsh realities of depression within the adolescent teenage mind, you got a connection that's taking place. If you would go, hey, he swears too much, but Salinger's really looking at the difficulty of relationships that exist, and you can't explain how the vulgar language ties in, you got two separate essays that are kind of dueling for supremacy on that line paper. But just like we did for the DRQ that you got back, that prompt you can fill out, you can come up with ideas, you bring that in on Monday. I'll have extras if you don't have it, but you'll be able to use them. So you're not responsible for quoting, but if you want to include quotations, you can put them on the top sheet and you can be good to go. And then Tuesday is when I would collect the capture the right list, and you'd be done. You don't do that quiz anymore.
When do you think it's
Never. On the day you get your diploma, thank Dr. Manarino's hand, and then you give me the grades for that. No, I feel you're using me, and that you don't appreciate me, that you just want me for a pass. So I'm standing my ground.
Is it worth having